David, hi.
Hi.
Thank you very much for talking to us today.
You're welcome.
You're HIV positive.
Yeah.
And can you tell me how long you've been HIV positive?
25 years next year's to end with the 25th year.
25 years?
Yeah.
You look remarkably well.
Thank you.
Can you tell me a little bit about those early days when you were first diagnosed? What happened and how did this all come about?
Early days, I had a problem with my sexuality coming out with my parents. That was a big shock to the system because I didn't know what was happening with myself. So to be also, diagnosed one day of being HIV positive in the sort of 85, 86, it was just devastating. It was just, my life was going to end in 6 months' time. Couldn't talk to my parents because it was just a taboo subject, basically. Fortunately, my sister, she's also gay, so I was able to relate to her quite a lot as well. And progressing in time now, I've got a relationship with my parents back again. But in those early years, it was awful because I didn't know what it was, basically. It just came from nowhere. And then one day I was diagnosed. They got my diagnosis wrong at first, and so I had to wait a couple of days. Then it was, I think it might have been a week actually, before we got the result back. So that in itself was a trauma. And my partner at the time then was more likely to be the positive one. I thought I was always the sensible one, and it turned out that she just said, "I'm afraid I've got bad news for you," and 25 years on, here I am today.
So 25 years is a long time, and HIV and AIDS has changed remarkably.
Yeah.
Do you remember the early days when people were dying of HIV and AIDS?
Yes, I've seen 20, 30 friends of mine just give up, basically. I think the first time people are diagnosed, you can go two ways. And I saw people as young as 18, 19 that would be dead 6, 8 months' time. And just purely because I don't know whether they'd handled the diagnosis properly, well, or the initial shock that it always was in those days. But I've certainly seen a lot of people die unexpectedly, and I think that there are different ways of dealing with it. And
I think that the difference between HIV today and how it was 15, 20 years ago is that really we had very little treatment to offer people in those days. And so if you presented very late, then the chances of you dying was very high, and the prognosis probably less than 6 to 12 months.
Yes.
Now, when we see people who are recently diagnosed in the clinic, it's a very different picture. And we're looking at telling people we're expecting to see them for the next 30 years or so.
Yeah.
Do you think that people take HIV seriously these days?
I find that there's still a stigma attached to HIV. There's still the jokes that are the AIDS jokes, and it's not AIDS anymore, it's HIV. It's an illness in its own, and from where I come from, there are still parents with children that think you can get it by touching, and so still the old sort of things are still attached to it, and I still find that it's a bit muddled up how HIV is presented these days. Yeah.
I mean, would you encourage people to get tested?
Oh, definitely. It's as I say, in the 80s it was, I was never going to see 40. I'm now coming up to 45 on my birthday, so it's manageable, and it's something that you can control yourself, but definitely testing. I think other diseases seem to come top of the list these days, whereas HIV can be just left behind a little bit, but I would definitely recommend.
Do you think that younger people are taking more risks than perhaps people were in your day who were more aware of the seriousness of HIV and AIDS?
It seems to come across these days that people are not... The government campaigns on television don't happen so much anymore. We've got, like yourself at Heartlands that are promoting sexual awareness, but I think that still we need to drum out to people that, you know, you've got to be safe, you've got to practice safe sex, because otherwise you can end up with several different sexual diseases. And I think, as I say, the television adverts were really grim at the time, and I still think that we still need a bit of, you know, a reminding to the people that it still exists.
Well, that was 1985, that last advertising campaign, the Tombstones. And of course, a lot of people who are now sexually active and going out for the first time weren't born at that time.
Yes.
I mean, the UK is in has a problem at the moment with sexually transmitted infections generally. 1 in 10 young people are infected with chlamydia who are sexually active under 24s. But I still don't think that people consider HIV could happen to them. Is that something that you would concur with?
Definitely, because I didn't know. I mean, okay, at the time I didn't know that the illness was around. It was rumoured, but I can say I'd try and be as safe as possible. But I ended up in that situation, and it only takes once. You know, it's so. As far as I was concerned, it was so easy to catch, and that's the thing that should be got across to people today. That it's not just about gonorrhea or anything else. It's also about HIV.
Okay. We're seeing a very big rise in heterosexuals. In fact, the number of heterosexuals who are diagnosed is actually twice that of gay men in Birmingham and the West Midlands. And I think a lot of people are unaware of that. They still see it perhaps as an infection that predominantly affects gay people.
Yes. Yeah, I do tend to find that it's still associated with sort of the gay population, and as I say, you get all walks of life now across the gay scene. You know, it's Manchester, for example, is become a scene that's more populated by heterosexual people on the gay scene, and it's very mixed now. It's a safe scene, so therefore heterosexual people use it, and you know, it's becoming mixed rather than segregated.
So you're suggesting that people who would classify themselves as heterosexual are having same-sex partners? Oh
yeah. I mean, it's. I'm finding that it's coming more apparent. I mean, you've only got to look at the scene itself. As I say, it's just becoming more integrated, and you're getting all walks of life across it. And I think at the end of the day, it's because it's a safe scene, because of what happens, you know, out at nights and with drinking and getting involved in fights or anything like that. I think the scene, because it is safe, that's why it does attract sort of the heterosexual side as well.
Of course, in the developing world, HIV is a huge problem, and again, it is heterosexual. And in Spain and in France and everywhere else, it's always been a heterosexual infection, because HIV is spread by sex, irrespective of what kind of sex. But I think that the stigma still in the UK and America is huge still.
Yeah, I do. I really do. It's like I say that. Just coming across to it, just for example, a mother with a child, I had an experience only a couple of years ago where it was devastation. It was, and yet that was just by touching. And there's not enough information out there. People think that, you know, you've more or less got to look at an HIV person and, you know, you're contracting it, that kind of thing. But no, there's just not that information, I don't feel, apart from what yourselves do at Heartlands. I think a lot of the work is left to the hospitals, whereas we're not getting any government advertising, we're not getting anything that's coming across between the breaks of Coronation Street when people, you know, almost watching the television. And I think that's why maybe there still is a stigma attached to it.
I mean, it's quite interesting. Of 800 people that we look after, I couldn't get any heterosexuals to talk about being HIV positive. And I think that is because of the stigma that still surrounds HIV.
And I must admit it was a bit of a problem for myself. But the work that you've done for me, I feel as though if you don't speak up and if you don't tell people out there, then we're not going to progress with this. We're not going to make it in the category where it's a manageable illness. I mean, such as diabetes, you know, that's what I've been more or less told. You know, it's manageable so long as you look after yourself and keep yourself a healthy mind, a healthy body.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.